every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The night air in Rome, in the summer of 1973, was thick with the scent of jasmine and exhaust fumes, a heavy blanket woven from centuries of history, and the relentless thrum of modern life. It was a city of profound contradictions, of sacred art and profane traffic, of ancient cobblestones slick with spilled wine, and shadows that stretched from Renaissance palazzos, deep and cold, even on the warmest evenings. Italy itself was a nation on a knife's edge. These were the anni di piombo, the years of lead, a time of violent political turmoil, extremist terror, and a pervasive sense of social unraveling. Kidnapping, or sequestro di persona, had become a grim cottage industry, a favored tactic of organized crime and political radicals alike. The wealthy lived in a state of constant low-grade fear, their children driven to school by bodyguards, their homes fortified against a threat that felt both random and ever-present. In the early hours of July 10th, in the grand Piazza Farnese, one of those ever-present shadows detached itself from the gloom and swallowed a boy whole. He was 16 years old, with a cascade of reddish-blonde hair and the languid, almost careless grace of youth. He was an heir to an impossible fortune, the grandson of the richest private citizen the world had ever known, yet he often found himself without enough lire for a pack of cigarettes. He was John Paul Getty III, a name that carried the weight of oil fields, art collections, and dynastic power. But on that night, walking home to his small apartment after an evening with friends, he was just Paul, a boy moving through the sleeping city, unaware that his name, his very existence, was about to become the subject of the most cold-blooded transaction imaginable. The attack was swift, professional, and brutal. A light-colored Fiat screeched to a halt. 3 men, their faces obscured, bundled him inside. A cloth soaked in chloroform was pressed over his face, and the ancient grandeur of Rome dissolved into blackness. When he awoke, he was in darkness, disoriented and cold. Chained to a stake in what felt like a damp cave, his life as he knew it was over. A new one, as a piece of human collateral, had just begun. The message that would soon be delivered to his mother was simple and chillingly direct. Her son was alive, for now, and his continued existence came with a price tag of 10 billion Italian lire, approximately 17 million US dollars. It was a staggering sum, but for his family, it should have been trivial. His grandfather, J. Paul Getty Sr., was a titan of industry, a man whose wealth was so vast it was almost abstract, a personal fortune estimated at $2 billion. 17 million was, for him, a rounding error. But as the world would soon discover, Getty the Sr. was a man who counted every penny, who famously installed a payphone in his English manor for his guests to use, a man who saw the world not through the lens of family, but through the unforgiving calculus of a balance sheet. And on that balance sheet, the life of his grandson was an unacceptable liability. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of a ransom. We will explore how a boy's life became a commodity, a bargaining chip in a grotesque negotiation between a ruthless criminal syndicate and a patriarch whose love for money seemed to outweigh his love for family. We will trace the 5-month ordeal of terror, the mother's desperate fight against an indifferent dynasty, and the gruesome act of violence that finally forced a breakthrough. This is the story of how much a human life is worth, and what happens when, to the one person who can afford it, the answer is not enough. To understand the brutal logic of the Getty kidnapping, you must first understand the two opposing poles of the story, the victim and the patriarch, They were bound by blood but separated by an unbridgeable gulf of wealth, experience, and philosophy. John Paul Getty III, known to everyone as Paul, was the product of a broken dynasty. He was the son of John Paul Getty Jr. and his first wife, Abigail Gail Harris. His parents' marriage had dissolved in the mid-1960s, a casualty of the very lifestyle the Getty fortune afforded. His father, Getty Jr., had been groomed to take over the family business, running Getty Oil's Italian operations. But he rebelled against his father's suffocating control. He embraced the counterculture of the swinging 60s in London, remarried the magnetic and tragically doomed actress Tala the Pole, and together they drifted through a haze of parties, drugs, and high society, much to the disgust of the elder Getty. After Talitha's death from a heroin overdose in 1971, Getty Jr. became a near recluse, sinking deeper into addiction and grief in London, his connection to his children from his first marriage becoming increasingly frayed. This left young Paul effectively adrift. He, his mother, and his siblings had moved to Rome, a city that perfectly suited his bohemian spirit. He was enrolled in St. George's British International School, but was expelled after a prank involving painting the school's hallway murals. By 16, Paul was living on his own, a figure known in the city's vibrant expatriate and artistic scenes. He was the golden hippie, a beautiful, free-spirited boy with a famous name who embraced a life of charming poverty. He sold his own sketches and jewelry to tourists, took part in leftist protests, and was a regular at the nightclubs and cafes of Trastevere. He lived on a tiny allowance from his mother, a pittance that did little to counter the assumption that he was secretly wealthy. He was, by all accounts, bright and gentle, but also rebellious and naive. He had reportedly joked on more than one occasion about staging his own kidnapping as a way to squeeze some money out of his famously tight-fisted grandfather. It was a foolish, youthful boast, a piece of teenage bravado that would soon come back to haunt him with terrible consequences. On the other end of the spectrum was the man who controlled everything, Jean Paul Getty Sr. Born in 1892 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, he was the son of a pioneering oilman. But his own ambition dwarfed that of his father. He was a paradox, a hedonist in his personal life, with a string of marriages, mistresses, and affairs, yet an ascetic in his financial affairs. He made his first million in oil by the age of 23. Through decades of ruthless negotiation, shrewd investment, and an almost preternatural ability to find oil where others saw none, he built Getty Oil into a global empire. His wealth was legendary, but so was his frugality. This wasn't just a quirky habit, it was a core tenet of his existence, a philosophy born from a deep-seated fear of losing control. He washed his own socks in his hotel room sinks to save on laundry bills. He would walk to business meetings to save on taxi fare, and in his magnificent 72-room Tudor mansion, Sutton Place, outside London, he installed that coin-operated telephone to prevent guests, staff, and even his own family from running up his phone bill. This mansion was his fortress. He rarely left it, surrounded by priceless art, Rembrandts, Titians, ancient Greek and Roman statues, and a pair of guard dogs named Nero and Tiberius. His philosophy on money extended to his family, whom he often treated as underperforming assets. He saw his wealth as a corrupting influence, a source of weakness in his descendants. He had 5 sons from 5 different marriages, and his relationships with them were fraught with disappointment and control. Tragedy was a constant companion to the Getty dynasty. His youngest son, Timmy, died of a brain tumor at age 12 in 1958. Getty, who was in Europe at the time, did not return for the funeral and had notoriously complained about the cost of his medical treatments. His eldest son, George Franklin Getty, died in 1973, just 1 month before Paul's kidnapping, from a self-inflicted gunshot wound after a cocktail of drugs and alcohol, a death ruled a probable suicide. Through it all, Getty Sr. remained emotionally distant, a man who found more comfort in his art collection than in his own kin. His refusal to pay a ransom was not a decision born in the moment of Paul's kidnapping. It was a long-held, publicly stated policy. He had told reporters years earlier, "I have 14 other grandchildren. If I pay 1 penny of ransom, I'll have 14 kidnapped grandchildren." It was a cold, hard line drawn in the sand, a business principle applied to the terrifying reality of human trafficking. To him, paying a ransom was not saving a life, it was setting a dangerous precedent, a poor investment that would yield only future losses. The first ransom note arrived just a day after the kidnapping. It was a crudely typed letter delivered to Paul's mother, Gail Harris. The demand for $17 million was accompanied by a chilling warning: do not contact the police. Gail, a woman of quiet strength and intelligence, now found herself in an impossible position. She was divorced from the Getty family, living on a modest alimony, and had virtually no access to the kind of money the kidnappers were demanding. The only people who did were her former father-in-law, a man she barely knew who lived by a rigid code of financial discipline, and her ex-husband, who was lost in his own world of addiction and grief in London. Her first instinct was to call the police, but she also knew the kidnappers' threat was real. Her second was to contact the family patriarch. The initial response from the Getty clan was one of disbelief and suspicion. Paul's own past jokes about faking his kidnapping immediately surfaced. The Italian police, the Carabinieri, were informed and quickly developed a working theory that the boy was not a victim, but a conspirator. They saw him as a rebellious teenager, a figlio di papa, or rich kid, who had likely orchestrated the whole affair with his bohemian friends to extort his grandfather. They questioned his circle, raided his apartment, and treated the case more like a juvenile prank than a serious crime. The media ran with this narrative, painting Paul as a decadent, spoiled youth, playing a dangerous game. This widespread skepticism cost crucial time. The first days and weeks of a kidnapping are the most critical for establishing contact, building a rapport with the captors, and securing the victim's safety. Instead, the investigation stalled, and the family, led by the patriarch's unyielding stance, did nothing. J. Paul Getty Sr., from the fortified safety of Sutton Place, issued a terse public statement through a spokesman, confirming his refusal to pay. "I have 14 other grandchildren," he repeated to the press, his voice a cold instrument of logic. "If I pay 1 penny now, then I will have 14 kidnapped grandchildren." He went further, suggesting that to give in to terrorists and criminals would only encourage more lawlessness, framing his decision as a stand for moral principle. The world was stunned. The press portrayed him as a heartless monster, a modern-day Scrooge. But Getty was unmoved by public opinion, which he had always disdained. He saw the situation not as a grandfather trying to save his grandson, but as a CEO defending his assets against a hostile takeover. Meanwhile, Gail Harris was living a waking nightmare. She was alone in Rome, hounded by paparazzi who camped outside her door, her phone tapped by the police. She was stonewalled by the very family, who held her son's life in their hands. She believed her son was in genuine danger. She recognized his handwriting in the pleading letters that began to arrive, smuggled out by the kidnappers. The first one read, "Dear Mommy, I have fallen into the hands of kidnappers. Don't let me be killed. Make sure that the police do not interfere. You must not joke with these people." But her pleas to Sutton Place were met with the same cold logic. Getty Sr. even suggested that perhaps Paul's mother was in on the scheme, a desperate attempt to get Getty money. The family was turning in on itself, consumed by suspicion, while Paul remained captive, his fate hanging in the balance. The kidnappers were not amateurs. They were a cell of the 'Ndrangheta, the powerful and notoriously brutal organized crime syndicate from the southern Italian region of Calabria. Unlike the Sicilian mafia, which had a certain public-facing code of conduct, and often focused on controlling territory and politics, the 'Ndrangheta were known for their pragmatism, their ferocity, and their focus on lucrative criminal enterprises. Kidnapping for ransom was one of their primary sources of income. They were methodical. They had chosen their target well. A high-profile name with seemingly bottomless pockets. They had watched Paul for weeks, learning his routines. What they hadn't counted on was J. Paul Getty. They had expected a quick, quiet transaction. Instead, they found themselves in a bizarre, protracted public negotiation with a man who refused to negotiate. For months, the stalemate continued. Paul was moved from one crude hiding place to another in the rugged, unforgiving mountains of the Aspromonte in Calabria. Damp caves, dark cellars, remote farmhouses. His captors were often brutal, sometimes indifferent. He was blindfolded for much of the time, chained, and fed a meager diet of bread, cheese, and olives. He listened to a small transistor radio, hearing news reports that debated whether he was even a real victim. The psychological torment of knowing that his own family, and much of the world, believed he was a fraud was almost as unbearable as the physical hardship. He tried to build a rapport with one of his guards, a man he could hear but not see. But the isolation and terror were immense. He later recalled the crushing loneliness and the constant fear of sudden, pointless death. Back in Rome, Gail was his only advocate. She worked tirelessly, a model of grace under unimaginable pressure. She became the sole point of contact, communicating with the kidnappers through classified ads in newspapers and harrowing brief phone calls. The kidnappers would call her at random times, day or night. The connections were always poor, the voices disguised and threatening. In one call, a kidnapper allowed Paul to speak. Gail heard his voice, weak but alive. "Why is grandfather not getting me out of here?" he asked, a question that hung in the air, unanswerable. Gail could only promise she was trying. She was trying to convince a man who had built an empire on the principle of never yielding. She was fighting a war on two fronts, against the criminals who held her son, and against the billionaire who held the key to his freedom. The kidnappers grew increasingly frustrated. Their investment was not paying off. Keeping a hostage is expensive and risky. The pressure from the police, however incompetent at first, was mounting. They needed to force the issue, to prove to the world, and specifically to J. Paul Getty, that this was not a game. Their communications became more threatening. A second letter from Paul arrived. More desperate this time. "It's no use being the richest man in the world if you are the meanest," he wrote. Likely under duress, the captors sent a recording of Paul's voice, pleading, "Get me out of here, Mommy." They were losing patience. In late October, nearly 4 months into the ordeal, they delivered a new message. It contained a stark ultimatum. If the family did not pay a revised ransom of $3 million, they would start sending Paul back in pieces. The Getty family, entrenched in their skepticism, still did not fully believe the threat. The patriarch's chief negotiator, a former intelligence agent named Fletcher Chase, suspected it was another bluff. They had received fake messages, and had been targeted by extortionists trying to cash in on the situation. They needed definitive proof that Paul was alive and that his captors were serious. The Ndrangheta, masters of brutal communication, decided to provide it in a way that could not be ignored, questioned, or dismissed. On a cold day, in November 1973, an envelope arrived at the Rome offices of the daily newspaper, Il Messaggero. It was postmarked from Naples. Inside was a plastic bag containing a lock of reddish-blonde hair and a severed human ear. The ear was decomposing, sliced cleanly from a human head. The package had been delayed for 3 weeks by an Italian postal strike, and its condition was grim. Accompanying this gruesome proof of life and of suffering was a typewritten note. It read, "This is Paul's ear. If we don't get some money in 10 days, then the other ear will arrive. In other words, he will arrive in little bits." The photograph of the severed ear, published on the front page, sent a shockwave of horror across Italy and around the world. The time for doubt was over. The kidnappers' message was unmistakable. The macabre package was their way of reopening negotiations, a letter written in blood and cartilage. Forensic experts, though hampered by the ear's poor condition, were eventually able to match its unique whorls and ridges to photographs of Paul. There could be no more debate. The golden hippie was a prisoner, and his captors were willing to mutilate him to prove their point. The act was barbaric, but from the kidnappers' perspective, it was a calculated business decision. They had to escalate. Paul later recounted the moment of his mutilation. It happened in a remote hut. He was held down, given a shot of brandy for the pain, and one of the men produced a razor. He begged them not to, but they were resolute. His right ear was sliced off without any effective anesthetic. The pain was excruciating, but the psychological terror was worse. It was the moment he understood that his captors saw him not as a human being, but as a collection of valuable parts. The ear was proof of concept. The rest of him was still on the table. To stop the bleeding, they used penicillin powder and bandaged his head, an act of crude medical care that likely saved his life but did nothing to diminish the horror. The public outcry was immense. The image of the mutilated teenager finally seemed to penetrate the fortified walls of Sutton Place. The pressure on J. Paul Getty became unbearable. He could no longer hide behind his principles of non-negotiation. His grandson was being dismembered piece by piece, the evidence mailed to a newspaper for the world to see. He finally, grudgingly agreed to pay. But J. Paul Getty would not simply write a check. The man who had built a $2 billion fortune did not become the richest in the world by making emotional decisions. Even in this moment of crisis, he would structure a deal. The kidnappers' demand had been reduced to approximately $3 million. Getty, after consulting with his accountants, agreed to pay a portion of it. He settled on a figure of $2.2 million. Why that specific amount? Because it was the maximum sum that his financial advisors determined would be tax-deductible under U.S. law at the time. He was, in effect, getting a tax break for ransoming his own grandson. He treated the ransom not as a rescue fund, but as a charitable contribution. This left a shortfall of around $800,000. Getty refused to cover it. Instead, in an act of breathtaking parsimony that would come to define his legacy, he offered to loan the remaining amount to his own son, John Paul Getty Jr., the boy's father. The loan would be subject to repayment in full, with a 4% annual interest rate. John Paul Getty Sr., a man who could buy countries, forced his financially and emotionally broken son, a man who himself was living on a trust fund controlled by his father, to go into debt to him at interest, to save his own child's life. It was the ultimate Getty transaction. Cold, precise, and profitable. It was a demonstration of absolute power, a reminder that even in matters of life and death, his financial control was paramount. With the deal structured to the patriarch's satisfaction, the complex and dangerous process of the ransom drop began. The family's security expert, Fletcher Chase, was tasked with delivering $3 million in Italian lire to one of the world's most dangerous criminal organizations. The money was meticulously counted and packed into sacks. The 'Ndrangheta gave their instructions. The money was to be driven south from Rome, along the Autostrada del Sole, the main highway connecting the north and south of Italy. The night of the drop was fraught with tension. Chase, accompanied by Gail Harris' new partner, drove the designated car. The kidnappers led them on a wild goose chase, giving a series of instructions over the phone to shake any potential police tail. They were directed off the main highway, onto dark, winding country roads in the Calabrian foothills. The final instructions came. Drive to a specific kilometer marker, stop the car on a bridge over a deep ravine, and wait. A light would flash from the darkness below. On that signal, they were to throw the bags of money over the side of the road and drive away without looking back. Chase followed the orders precisely. The car stopped. The night was pitch black. A single light blinked from the ravine. He and his companion hauled the heavy sacks of cash to the guardrail and pushed them over. They tumbled into the darkness. For a moment, there was only the sound of their own breathing and the dark, empty road. Then, they got back in the car and drove on, their part of the bargain fulfilled. The money was gone. Now, all they could do was wait and pray that the 'Ndrangheta would honor theirs. For 3 agonizing days, there was nothing. The silence from the kidnappers was terrifying. Had they taken the money and killed the boy anyway? Had something gone wrong? Gail Harris was tormented by the possibilities. She had endured 5 months of hell, and now, in the final moments, she was powerless once again. Then, on December 15, 1973, a truck driver on a rural road near Loria, in the province of Potenza, saw a lone figure stumbling by the side of the road in the freezing rain. The figure was thin and shivering, with a crude bandage wrapped around the side of his head. The truck driver, recognizing the famous face from the newspapers, stopped. It was John Paul Getty III. He was finally free, but he was a wreck. 5 months in captivity had taken a devastating toll. He was malnourished, suffering from a raging infection in his unhealed wound where his ear had been, and had contracted pneumonia from being left out in the cold. But the deepest wounds were not visible. He was traumatized, disoriented, and haunted by his ordeal. He was taken to a local hospital, and the world learned that the Getty heir was alive. One of the first things Paul wanted to do was to thank the man who had ultimately paid for his freedom. He called Sutton Place, hoping to speak to his grandfather. The call was put through, but J. Paul Getty refused to come to the telephone. He had completed his transaction, and as far as he was concerned, the business was concluded. He had never met his grandson, and he would die 3 years later without ever doing so. The loan, however, was a different matter. He fully expected his son to pay it back, with interest. The release of Paul Getty III triggered a massive manhunt by the Italian authorities. Though the 'Ndrangheta was a secretive and formidable organization, they had made mistakes. The police, using marked bills from the ransom and intelligence from informants, began to close in. Over the next few years, 9 men were arrested in connection with the kidnapping. They were a mix of 'Ndrangheta bosses, foot soldiers, and logistical helpers, including a carpenter who had built a special box to transport Paul and a man whose truck had been used in the abduction. Among those implicated was a high-ranking boss, Saverio Mammoliti. The subsequent trials were a complex and messy affair, typical of Italian justice at the time. The code of silence, or omerta, was strong. Witnesses were intimidated. Evidence was hard to come by. 2 of the men were convicted and sent to prison, but their convictions were later overturned on appeal. In the end, only 2 of the 9 men arrested faced long-term imprisonment for their roles. The top-level organizers, the men who had sanctioned the kidnapping and profited most from it, were largely believed to have escaped justice. The vast majority of the $3 million ransom was never recovered. It vanished back into the criminal economy of Calabria, likely funding future 'Ndrangheta operations. More kidnappings, more drug traffic, more violence. Justice was at best partial and unsatisfying. The kidnappers had, for the most part, gotten away with it. For John Paul Getty III, freedom was not an end to his suffering, but the beginning of a new kind of prison. He never fully recovered from the trauma of his 5-month ordeal. The world saw him as the golden hippie who had returned from the dead, but he was a changed person. He moved to New York and tried to immerse himself in the art scene, becoming a peripheral figure in Andy Warhol's circle. But he was battling severe post-traumatic stress disorder and a growing dependence on drugs and alcohol. The physical and psychological scars were too deep. He was haunted by what had happened to him in the dark caves of Calabria, and by the chilling realization of his own value, or lack thereof, in the eyes of his family. He married a German photographer, Gisela Martin Sachar, when he was just 18, and they had a son, Balthazar, who would go on to become a successful actor. But his life continued its downward spiral. The Getty fortune that had defined his life and nearly ended it remained largely out of his reach. He was plagued by nightmares and addiction. In 1981, at the age of just 25, a cocktail of Valium, methadone, and alcohol caused a massive stroke. It left him quadriplegic, partially blind, and unable to speak. He would spend the rest of his life confined to a wheelchair, cared for by his devoted mother, Gail, the one person who had fought for him from the very beginning. His father, John Paul Getty Jr., eventually overcame his own addictions and became a noted philanthropist in the United Kingdom, donating hundreds of millions of pounds to arts and culture, for which he was eventually knighted by the Queen. It was a remarkable turnaround, but it came too late for his son. John Paul Getty III lived for another 3 decades in his silent, paralyzed world, a living monument to the trauma he had endured. He passed away in 2011 at the age of 54. His life was not defined by the Getty billions, but by the 5 months in 1973 when that fortune was withheld. J. Paul Getty Sr. died in 1976, just 3 years after the kidnapping. He left the bulk of his immense fortune not to his family, but to the J. Paul Getty Museum in California. His legacy remains a complex one. A brilliant self-made titan of industry, a connoisseur of art with impeccable taste, and a patriarch who treated his family like a corporate subsidiary. He is remembered as much for the art he collected as for the grandson he refused to ransom. His refusal was not just a single act of cruelty, it was the ultimate expression of a life lived by a brutal, unyielding code, where everything and everyone had a price. And so we return to the central anatomy of this case, the anatomy of the ransom itself. A kidnapping is always a transaction, a crude exchange of money for a human life. But the Getty case stripped this transaction down to its most elemental, horrifying components. It became a public dissection of value. To the Ndrangheta, Paul Getty's life was worth $17 million, a figure later negotiated down to $3 million. To the media, his story was worth millions in newspaper sales and ratings. To his mother, he was priceless, a son for whom she would have given everything she had, if she had had anything to give. But it was his grandfather, the man with everything, who performed the most chilling calculation of all. He valued his grandson's life at $2.2 million, the maximum tax-deductible amount. And even then, a part of that price was not a payment, but a loan, extended to his own son at 4% interest. The ransom was paid, and a life was technically saved from the immediate threat of the kidnappers. But the ordeal revealed a chilling ledger of its own, a family balance sheet where love was a liability and a grandson's safety was, for a time, a poor investment. The Getty kidnapping is a singular case, not because of the brutality of the criminals, but because of the almost inhuman calculus of the patriarch. It stands as a permanent, unsettling monument to the idea that sometimes the coldest prisons are not the ones with chains, but the ones gilded in gold. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.